I guess I'm starting. I thought that I would mostly read from my original statement in the proposal for this show, where we're putting together
You have to keep it closer.
our concept of forces of nature. And so I thinking through my relationship with nature, starting as a very small child, I spent a lot of time in the dirt. And I enjoyed, despite the fact that it was a requirement in my household. We had a garden and a big garden, and so and 5 children in a family. And my father was from Minnesota, and where children were labor. And so we did a lot of, I don't mean to make it sound like we were browbeaten, but we did have like charts on the back of the kitchen door with how much time we were supposed to spend doing which chores in the yard. So that's how summers were spent. We gardened, I did weeding, we cleared brush, but weeding as a small child was sort of crawling through the garden. And so I sort of, as I was thinking about my art, I was thinking about, well, that's sort of how I see the world, is from that very close-up perspective of plants and nature and the light coming through the plants. And so that was sort of how it started. And also, since my father was an architect, and I worked in his office, and my favorite place was the model shop. And so building models involved, once the structures were built, the small-scale models, we planted a lot of little trees that were made of yarrow. I don't know if you guys know yarrow or you're familiar with architectural models, but there's a lot of tree planting that goes on at a very small scale. The trees are this size. So the two sort of perspectives of working from way up high and creating forests and creating gardens and landscapes around the buildings that were designed in that office. And then that juxtaposed with the crawling around in the dirt and doing a lot of weeding and gardening. Combined with one other thing, and then I'll stop, which is that I have a lazy eye. My right eye is kind of lazy. I was born that way. It works, but it doesn't track all that well. And so I don't see three-dimensional things particularly well. I can see that there's 3 dimensions. I mostly check for shadows when I want to see how round something is. So that is part of why my work is as flat as it is. It's because that's how I see things. And I enjoy that. It's not like I'm not sad about it or anything. It's just, that's how I see things. And so that is another aspect of the way the light comes through things, and I just tend to flatten everything out. So distance is created by flat shapes in a certain amount of depth that way. So transparency and layers, and so that's how I see things. So I think that's really all I needed to say. So I'll pass this down.
So hearing Marina describe sort of her micro world as a child is kind of an interesting contrast to what I have made here, which is in response to having gone to Iceland last summer, where the landscape is so vast. I mean, and glaciers in particular, even though they are losing them, they are by their very nature vast, deep, ancient, thousands of years depth of snow. And it was this one particular place in Iceland called Jökulsárlón, where the glacier has receded. It used to butt up against the Atlantic Ocean, and it's receded more than 6 miles. And in doing so, as it's melted, it's created a lagoon. And into that lagoon are icebergs, hundreds of icebergs floating in the lagoon. And then the lagoon is actually the icebergs that float out of the lagoon into the ocean, or they end up beaching on this glassy beach. So it's this extraordinary visual experience, but it's also very, it was very emotional because of the extreme beauty, but the extreme sadness of thinking about losing these amazing visual things in the world. And I really felt that, there may be people here, maybe some of you have seen glaciers and had those experiences, but I was really also thinking about all the people in urban areas who don't see trees and don't see glaciers. So I was really trying to create sort of pictorially this sense of the beauty and then the loss simultaneously. And I started out as a photographer, so there's a lot of sort of framing of images that goes back to my being a photographer. I subsequently went to medical school, but I always made art through my life. I'm now retired, so this is I devoted the last basically 10 months to this. And I'm not sure I'm done. I think I'm feeling so strongly about this issue of the glaciers that there may be more in the future.
I'm Lia Rothstein, and I also was a photographer for a very long time, for about 40 years. And I have always enjoyed, in whatever art practice I had, working with various kinds of natural materials. And I live in the Hanover area. I know some of you are here in the audience. And I started to think about the fact that every time I washed a paintbrush, that paint goes down the drain into my private septic system. And then I started to think, okay, then what happens in the groundwater? I'm washing acrylic paint down, where's it going? Well, of course, it's feeding into all the groundwater that accumulates then in rivers and streams and ends up in the ocean. So I started doing research about microplastics and nanoplastics in the ocean, which of course there's been a lot of literature about that now, but at the time that I started thinking about it, there wasn't that much out there. I had gone to Iceland in 2009 for the first time, and that was the first time we traveled with Icelandic friends that I became aware of the effect of climate change. And then I went back to Iceland in 2012 and did an artist residency there and saw other parts of Iceland and how much it had changed from 2009 to 2012 was very dramatic. So it was kind of all of these interests in the environment and what was happening, what was changing, kind of all coalesced when I started washing paintbrushes down my drain and thinking about that more seriously. So I started experimenting with biomaterials to try to figure out if I could create sculpture and also maybe two-dimensional work using materials that would be biodegradable and safer for the environment. And I did a lot of research, and I really wished I'd taken chemistry in college because I couldn't understand most of what I was reading in the scientific papers, so I had to keep looking up words. But I started experimenting with things like starches and sweet potato and cornstarch and gelatins and seaweed and other things, trying to figure out if there was a material that could give me the effect that I wanted, that would be safer for the environment. And I discovered this material. This piece, which is called As Above, So Below, is made out of a material called chitosan. And chitosan is essentially, it's a material found in nature. This piece is made from crab shells that have been broken down by being pulverized and then mixed with basically vinegar to make a liquid. And then I form it in order to make the sculpture. And this material is non-toxic. It's used in water purification systems. It's used as a fertilizer. It's used as a fire retardant for clothing. It's used in surgery because it dissolves in liquid. So if I took this sculpture and put it in the rain, in 2 days it would disappear into the ground, apart from the metal pieces, which wouldn't. But every other part of it would just completely dissolve. And it would also fertilize the ground, and it wouldn't cause any environmental damage. So I really became interested at that point in art that maybe doesn't need to last forever, which is kind of ironic because as a photographer, and I worked at Dartmouth as a photo archivist at one time, I really was concerned about preserving, using only archival materials and preserving photographs that would last forever. But now I'm more interested in art that maybe we don't have to accumulate so much stuff, but that is more ephemeral and trying to make more of a statement about that. And so As Above, So Below is really about I started thinking about microplastic pollution in the oceans and how the particles become smaller and smaller until they end up on the ocean floor where the fish eat them, and then we eat the fish. And we all know from reading how many microplastics are actually in our human tissue now. So those are the kinds of things that I've been wrestling with and thinking about. And I think I'll stop there. We have a statement from Stephanie, who couldn't be here, that I could read to the group. Is that thing that I do? Yeah. Okay. Stephanie's work is right behind the caustic and the natural forms, which are often mushrooms and other materials. And I'll read her statement. She unfortunately couldn't be here with us this weekend. Here's her statement. Assembling a history plays an important role in my encaustic painting. In 2015, I found a bin of old family letters from the 1920s to the 40s. They were written by members of my paternal family who were cowboys and farmers in West Texas. They reference the Dust Bowl and difficulty keeping cattle alive, as well as the ongoing drought that decimated the farmlands. To make matters worse, the Great Depression hit. The reading was fascinating and made my troubles insignificant in comparison. But as I continued to experiment with encaustic forms, I found a relationship in the stress marks and layers. I began combining these letters with echo printing and rusted papers below the surface as metaphors for struggle, endurance, and change. Their stains, information, and wear reference the passing of time. Many layers of wax are applied and literally cover up the past. Encaustic, as it cools, retains every scrape and scar. As a material, it has an innate feature for documentation. Seemingly destructive to the surface, the peeling plays a positive role as it reveals a small piece of history while other areas remain buried. It unearths a stratum of time reminiscent of the Earth's core. Most recently, I have started to use patterns below the surface. The last 3 years have been a journey that has felt like a maze. The patterns that I've developed in the labyrinth began as exercises to get my focus back after my sister passed away. The pattern felt like a structure of her bones. This piece is about the pathways that shape a life. Sorry. Times where we come out and face the world, and times when we retreat. The depth created working in relief is jarring, alluring, and frightening. There is risk involved in the process, but working in relief this way conveys a sense of resilience in life. It speaks with a boldness and beauty, which is also fragile. Very articulate statement.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So at this point, we thought we would open it up to questions. We also have questions that we have kind of prepared that we could ask of each other, but we encourage you to who've honored us with your presence here today to ask any questions that you may want to ask. And if it's about Stephanie's work, we would be able to maybe answer it from a technical standpoint, because the four of us know each other from belonging to New England Wax organization, so we're very familiar with each other's work, and that's how our friendship formed, and the relationships that form the basis for creating this exhibition. So feel free, anyone, to ask whatever you may be thinking about.
I have a question. I'm interested in the fact that at least two of you are photographers, and I'm wondering if you found that to be a necessary basis for the work that you do, or how it influenced what you do.
Do you want to start?
I mean, I started doing photography somewhat seriously in high school. I mean, I worked in a dark room hours upon hours upon hours, you know, back in the days of film, clearly. I then went to art school, and after art school worked as a photographer for an architect. So I think it's such an integral part of the way I see, that when I think about this work that I've done, I usually work on multiple pieces at a time, and I think about that as almost a film strip. It's going from one image to part of the next image to part of the next image. And I also think about, in a photograph, the framing, and you know, what's at the edge of the frame, so what does it imply is not in the picture? And I especially think about that now in terms of painting, that I'm very intrigued by framing things in ways that there's a lot to be said just beyond the frame, leading you off. So I think that, you know, this lifelong way of looking at things definitely has influenced what I do.
And for me, as a photographer for a really long time, I'm very attracted to materials that are translucent and about light and color. So when I started experimenting with these different biomaterials, some of them were very opaque, and they didn't interest me as much as working with a material that's very translucent, because I'm really interested in the way light and color interact. So I think that's why I gravitated to this particular biomaterial. So far I find it, I'm the most aesthetically interested in this material in particular. And I'm also really thinking a lot about time, and of course it's essential in photography. Everything is measured in fractions of a second. But as I think about environmental issues in particular, my notion of time is a little bit more, I don't know, maybe cross-sectional, that I also am thinking about, I have grandchildren, and I'm worried about the environment and what's going to be for them as I get older and older. And so I think that aspect of time and the role it plays in photography is probably a factor for me too. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks.
I can see now that it's been brought up, the translucency and the overlap that you all three bring to the show. And did you come together knowing that, or is it just an aesthetic that you all happen to share? Or, I just, it's obviously very beautiful and effective, but I think it's interesting the different points of view and how it comes off, how it comes together, especially yours, Marina, where, you have the lazy eye, and this is how you see life,
I think we all are part of a group of artists who work with wax, and I think our initial, at least my initial attraction to incorporating wax into my work was because it provides a layer, it provides a translucency, and when you work with wax, light has a tendency to, it refracts and reflects off the surface of what you're working on. So it bounces into the painting or the artwork, and then it bounces out, and then it also is reflecting off the surface. So that's sort of the nature of a lot of the people who work with encaustic or with wax. So there was that, and then maybe just, I think, there.
And the translucency of the wax and how you can modify it with cold wax and with encaustic, how opaque an area can be and how translucent it can be. And for me, it also, when I was doing a lot of photography, I did a lot of multiple exposure images. So I was using transparency in interesting ways. And so this was a way in painting to mimic that, which I really loved with film, with multiple exposures.
The way we came together to do this exhibit together, we know each other, all four of us, and I've been involved in AVA for a long time, so I actually picked them and asked them if they would like to make a proposal for this show, because I did feel the affinity of the work, knowing their work really well, knowing them as people, and I didn't think that the work would all, would work together. Even I'm not working in wax with this work, but I knew enough about Deb's work and Marina's and Stephanie's to think that we all are interested in forces of nature, both external and internal, and in different ways. And so I did think that it would be compatible aesthetically as well as contextually.
So full disclosure, Lia and I have known each other for years. So one of the things that I'm sort of curious about is, a couple things. One is I'm interested in the whole thing about, this idea of the art materials that we use. And so the environmental impacts of those and how, as artists, we can think about a practice in ways that where we're not sort of shut down, but also not overwhelmed with regard to the materials we're using and feeling like we can't do our work because feeling badly about the materials that we're working. So within that context, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Lia, but also for Deb and Marina, to talk about whether knowing you and the work that you're doing in the research has influenced the other people in the group, and Stephanie also, you can speak to that. And also, if you can speak just a tiny bit about the coloring, because that's something that is the color of the chitosan white or clear, and whether the colorants are something that is also an environmental. Do you think about the environmental impacts of the other material, like that makes the colors like they are? So
she directly said this question to me, not knowing that I brought samples that I'll pass around of this biomaterial. And the biomaterial in its native state is this color. It's basically clear with a slight yellowing. And I'll just pass it around so you all can feel what it feels like. It can be quite strong if I pour it very thickly. It can be very thin and brittle. If I heat it, it gets more brittle. It changes in humidity. It's very reactive to the environment. So I'll just pass that around.
So is it, before this state, is it a liquid?
It's a liquid. It's a liquid, yeah. Initially as a crab shell, it's a crab shell. The material is also found in butterfly wings and beetles and fungi, actually, too. They crush up the shells and then mix it with basically vinegar in order to break it down into a liquid state. Somebody asked me last night if it was like diatomaceous earth that what so many of us put in our gardens, and it's broken down similarly, except in order to become a liquid, it has the vinegar added to it. And I have sheets here with resources for artists about safer environmental practices of disposing of materials, and I have sheets that I can pass out to whoever's interested. And I also have it on the resource page on my website, so I'm happy to hand that out to anybody who's interested. The colorants for me, wherever possible, I've colored the material with a botanical substance. So I've used everything from coreopsis to butterfly pea flower to hollyhocks, and about 5 buckthorn, other flowers that I've ground up and made into a pigment in order to color it. And those I know are completely environmentally safe. Apart from that, and some of the more metallic surfaces are from a pigment company in Germany. And although they would tell me whether it was safe to mix it with this material that has the acetic acid in it, because I was afraid of what could happen in the studio when I might be breathing in, and I wear a respirator when I work with any pigment. But I was kind of afraid because if I heat it, I didn't know what that might release. The chemists assured me that everything I was doing was safe and environmentally responsible, but they would not divulge exactly what it was made of for some of them. But the others that I made myself, I'm confident in. Yeah.
So I just have a follow-up question. So can you just talk a little bit about how you make it into the forms that we see here? Like, so it's a liquid, so then what happens?
It's a liquid. It's an unusual material because it's liquid until it becomes completely dry and solid. There's no working with it in any kind of in-between stage. So unlike clay, for those of you who might work in clay or pottery, there's a stage at which it's very soft, and then it gets to a semi-hard stage, and then it gets finally cooked in a kiln. But with this material, it's completely goopy, and you can't control it or manipulate it at all until it's completely dry. And then when it's dry, it does whatever it wants. It's not controllable at all. I can draw a form, but when it dries, it might shrink differentially. It might be completely different. So it's not controllable in that way. And what I do, sometimes I mold it. For example, the piece that's in the corner, the blue one, that one I did pour the material into a mold and release it. But when it came out of the mold, it wasn't that shape at all. It continued to change with the humidity, and I can't stop that. And then I just decide what I'm going to do with it after that point. I can re-wet it in order to shrink it. When I made this piece, it was about 1.5 times wider at the bottom than it is right now. It's just changed over the months that I've been working on it. And I've just come to kind of accept that it's a living natural material and it's going to change and evolve. And I hope it just holds up for the whole show.
Isn't there some fabric in there?
There is, yeah. There's silk pieces on the bottom that are dangling down. That's silk with the biomaterial on it. So the silk is the substrate there. And also the central, what's on the interior, there are pieces of silk with the biomaterial there as well as just the biomaterial itself. And the lotus piece over there is white silk with the biomaterial on it.
Hi, so the title is Forces of Nature. I'm picking up on transience and beauty. But perhaps you might say something whether you feel this is true of your work, that they represent forces of nature. I don't know if it's a good question.
It sounds like a question. It sounds like a question. Did you want to say further?
But do you see your own work as such? There's a lot of movement in the work, and there's light and transparency. But I'm struggling to understand them in the context of the name of the show as Forces of Nature. That one, whoever did those, it seems clearest. But the forces of nature in these are also it's very clear, but it's very, very different.
That's okay. That's okay, because nature takes all different kinds of forms.
Okay, so then the other question is, how do these works, how do these works speak to this time that we are living in right now? As part of nature, and how do they speak to us? These are just open questions, and I'm just not clear about that.
I mean, I feel strongly that there's a collision between aspects of nature that have been extant for millennia and what we are doing to our environment. So there's actually a force of non-nature affecting nature. So I think that, that it isn't just purely looking at nature as it is, but it's looking at the consequence of human activity on nature or parts of nature.
And these are artifacts of that?
Well, I would, to me, the loss of the glacier is precipitated by the warming of our environment. So we're losing millennia of accumulated ice in a few generations of human time. So that's a force that's affecting nature and will affect nature in terms of weather events and other things. So it's a collision of forces, really.
And I would say, Richard, that you came in after I spoke. I'm probably the most not obvious part of, the title, and I did explain it, but you weren't here yet. So I can explain it to you later.
Sure.
it's not the same question at all, but it's more of a philosophical thing. Is like, if, you know, I'm an artist, and in my dream, you know, I admire all this art that came from centuries and millennia ago, and I am very much into trying to do what I can in an archival way. And yet, you're like, no, you know, it's going to dissolve. It's going to not be here in a few generations, and that's okay too. So, how do you grapple, or what is your outlook? Not just it, but your outlook on the permanency or the future of your art for, you know, if you can imagine future generations taking notice of what you've done.
Well, I think as an artist, especially as you get older, and I've been an artist my whole life, but it's taken different forms. I used to be a weaver, and I wove rugs for many years, and then I was an illustrator, and so I worked in illustration, and lots of stuff printed, books, magazines, murals, all sorts of things that ultimately are kind of ephemeral when you are an illustrator. And now I'm a painter, and I don't, you know, when you're painting, or when you're doing any kind of art, I think especially in this time, it's really difficult to say, well, I have to just use archival materials. I know there are a lot of people, a lot of artists who are very intent on making sure that their art lasts forever and a day, but it really doesn't matter. It matters how it feels when you're doing it. It matters what you're trying to express, and what you're actually expressing, you know, is close to what you were thinking, and those kinds of things. I also saw, I mean, obviously you just don't want to fill the world up with trash. So, you know, bigger and bigger paintings are not really the point either. I saw a very interesting video of preservationists at MoMA in New York, who did a series of videos during the pandemic when they were trying to explain what they were doing because the museum was closed, and they were reorganizing things, and they were deciding what was important and what wasn't important, and women's art was coming up, and they were taking responsibility for the fact that they had been misrepresenting mid-century art for all these years, and so that was an interesting conversation. So what comes up and what comes down, you know, what's in storage and what people can see. And then they were also talking about how they, as preservationists, they loved it when artists did things that didn't last forever because it kept them in business. But what they were saying beyond that was that it was interesting for them, and that artists needed to be pushing boundaries. And if artists weren't pushing boundaries about how to make things and what they wanted to say and how they wanted to say it, that art would be boring. So that's just sort of tangential, but I think it's relevant.
Yeah, and in terms of the ephemerality, I really am interested in thinking about, I hope my work maybe gets some artists to think about, well, maybe I could use a different material instead of, I'll just pick on acrylics today because it's plastic, it comes from fossil fuels. And so maybe it turns out there is a very good company that makes natural earth acrylic. It's like an acrylic paint, but it's completely non-toxic and good for the environment. And a few of my artist friends have started using a little different materials. And it's not that I feel that artists should not use the material that they want to say what they want to say. I think they should, but I think there are other artists that are just haven't been exposed to other options. And so I love to experiment. And I'm hoping that even if this piece, I know it's going to make it through the show, Sam. That was a joke. Unless the sprinkler system goes on for some reason, in which case I can't promise. But I also am interested in thinking about doing more performance work that I make something that gets put out in the woods, and when it rains, it dissolves into the earth and fertilizes whatever's underneath it. Or I said last night at the opening, I said maybe I would make a garment of clothing and stand out in a rainstorm, and I would be fully clothed. Don't worry. But I'm more interested in just getting people to kind of think about things than about producing something that someone's going to own in their home or be acquired by an institution or something like that. That's where I am now, at this point in my career.
I definitely don't think about, like, is this going to be around in 50 years or 100 years? Except now that I'm so focused on glaciers, it's more what the subject is and what it depicts that won't be around potentially. So it's more like a natural history text from 100 or 200 years ago that shows animals or insects who've become extinct. So without that, we would know nothing about those things. And there are, I think it's in Montana, there's a group of artists who are drawing serial pictures of the glaciers of the Pacific Northwest specifically to have a documentation of the changes and that we're losing these. So I think about it more in the context of for a future generation to know what we've lost and what it looked like, but not as the object itself so much.
And the other part of that for me too, just tag on to what Deb just said, when I was the climate change artist in residence at the Brattleboro Museum last year for the year 2023, and the reason that the museum picked the proposal that I made was because they thought it was hopeful. I mean, it's so easy to get so depressed. Every day we read something else about climate change and what's happening. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by it. And when I started doing reading for the residency, I did get depressed. The more I read, the more afraid I got. And the reason they picked my proposal was that they thought it was very hopeful, because there's so many people around the world doing research in bioplastic materials now to take the place of single-use plastics. I mean, there are companies all over the world, many of them, especially in Europe. I'll just mention a couple. There's a company called Sway that is making all kinds of bags for clothing and products out of seaweed. Not plastic in the UK, which just won an award by the British government, a huge award for the research that they're doing in edible pods. So things like all kinds of food containers, but also for the London Marathon, they put water in these pods made of seaweed, and they give them to the runners, and they just eat them because it's completely safe and non-toxic. So anything that's like a condiment, like ketchup or soy sauce, or anything you would get in a restaurant, Not makes this container that you can just eat. So there is no waste whatsoever. And there are many, many companies like that. So there's a lot of hope out there in the scientific community about things that are at this point quite expensive per item. And the problem with plastic is it does so many things so well, so cheaply, but it isn't really cheap. I mean, it isn't cheap. Dealing with the aftermath of it is not cheap, but people don't tend to think of it that way on a daily basis. So I think there is a lot of hope out there for new innovation.
do respond to them as statements, and I have been wondering what a statement is in my own work. And I think they function well that way, as statements. There may be a bias here against toxicity. I don't find them terribly. Never mind. They're not challenging in a way that something which is might be described as toxic would be. Toxic is not necessarily a bad thing. There are all sorts of things that are toxic. That's the world we live in.
Marina, can you talk about your process a little bit and where these compositions stem from? Yeah.
I think I would say I am a color person. I'm sort of colorist. Is a word that doesn't quite work for me, but color is the most important thing. And usually when I'm thinking about starting a composition, it's usually inspired by color. Often that's outside, combination of forms outside, but I usually start with color, and then I often start by sketching on my iPad, which we talked about last night. I love the iPad. There's a little blurb, a short blurb in my video about the iPad, but because since I was an illustrator, I was a digital illustrator because that was because I started doing illustration when the whole publishing industry went digital. So I jumped in there, and I learned to work on the computer with a tablet, so back to the iPad, which is way more fun, and I play with color there, and I work in layers there, and I sort of formulate what it is that I'm thinking about with color, and then after that, the shapes evolve, because the shapes kind of evolve in relation to the color, which is hard to really explain, but that's just how my brain works. And some of those are inspired by, a lot of them are inspired by my garden. And I spend a lot of time, I said at the beginning of my statement that I spent a lot of time in the dirt as a child, but I spend a lot of time in the dirt still. I have a very large garden, and I spend a lot of time there, and so a lot of the forms sort of spring from there, and even in paintings, there aren't obvious, it was sort of challenging for me, the forces of nature concept, because my work has never really contained plants, but there are often plants in the underpaintings of things. You just can't see them. So the layers that you don't see often have plants underneath them, and then I've covered them up. I think in this painting over here, I'll just jump up. This painting here is the fourth painting I've done of my apple tree, which has now come down. And I called it the last homage to the apple tree because it's really gone, and I'm not going to paint it again. But in the background here, you can see there's some other plant forms in there that you can barely see. So there's underpaintings of plants. And then that that is sort of, it doesn't look like an apple tree, but the apple tree sat in front of the living room window for 50 years and had a very dark shape, and the afternoon light came through from behind it. So that's afternoon light coming through the apple tree. So that's sort of how my mind works. That one behind you is the smoke bush. The yellow one behind you is the smoke bush and the light coming through the leaves. And it shifted. It doesn't really look. In my video, there's a picture of the light coming through the smoke bush. It's a green smoke bush, not the purple one. So that answered the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering if you might talk about where you source this crab material. Like, are they horseshoe crabs that are already being gathered for blood and?
No. The company that I've been working with, which is based in Seattle, uses crab shells that would otherwise just be thrown away. And they use about 6% of what's available that gets completely just thrown away in landfills. So they're using a material, they're repurposing a material that would otherwise just be waste. No, they don't use horseshoe crabs. It's from the crab meat industry and shrimp industry, and they're an industrial company. So they, when they found out what I was doing, they were willing to ship me the material for free. I just had to pay for the shipping, which was expensive. But they gave me the material. And to do this particular project, they shipped me 2 55-gallon oil drums, which are on pallets in my garage. Yeah, so.
Is it already pulverized?
It's already liquid.
Oh, it's liquid.
It's already liquid. I have bought it dry before the acid is added to it. I have bought that, but they have formulated an especially thick solution that's easier for me because each piece takes a couple days to dry. And the thicker it is, the faster it dries. But if it was even thinner and more liquid, it would just take that much longer.
And do you create the holes that are, it seems like most of them have these kind of holes in the center.
Yes, I do.
Okay, that's just.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So you mix the pigment into the liquid on a hot pallet? Is that how you do it?
No, I mix it cold, and then sometimes I let it dry naturally on the surface, and sometimes I do heat it up underneath because I have this big hot surface that I have used for encaustic painting, and I kind of heat it on that to speed up the drying. If I lived in New Mexico, it would dry a lot faster than it does in New England, where it's cold in the winter and humid in the summer. So I might be living in the wrong state. Yeah. So no, I mix it when it's cold.
You know, one thing I was gonna, if Stephanie were here, she would be talking about how she has her own beehives and it's her family business.
Right.
And they, so that's kind of part of, the whole nature, involvement of nature with her work.
Right.
And gathering mushrooms, she gathers mushrooms to eat, and then she gathers them to work with it.
I think she's a mushroom expert.
Yes, she is.
Yeah. She goes foraging and takes even groups of people to identify mushrooms, and she's very knowledgeable about them. But this is a particular kind that Deb actually collected some for her in the Northwest and shipped them back. This is especially hard.
Very hard.
Yes, my husband and I were in Oregon and Washington State about a month and a half ago, and whenever we went on a hike, we were looking for mushrooms for Stephanie, and we sent her a box full of these rather large, rather damp, they had to be dried out when she got them, mushrooms. So I'm sad that she's not here to talk more about that.
Yeah, actually, I have a blurb that I have a thing that she wrote, and it says, I've been a forager for mushrooms for many years. Some of these hard wood-like shelf mushrooms have been sitting on my windowsills in the studio, and I layered some pigmented wax on one in particular, which sat around for a while. The wax adhered to it beautifully. As my work developed, I was creating other materials that had marks of age, like rusted papers, eco-printing, things that added a sense of that past and a history of life. Many of the family letters had stains on them from water and age. All these elements fit in together, and I think of it as assembling a history. My thoughts with the mushrooms is also that they are amazing recyclers of dead matter. I also feel they are an element close to me, and it is a way of adding a part of my history.
I'm curious how you collectively landed on forces of nature as a theme, and where each of you were in your creative process at the time.
I think we were trying to come up with a concept that we could all fit into, and you know, as artists, and since we work in this other group, which we referenced, we often have group shows that have a sort of an overarching title, because everybody's work can be so different. And so we struggled to find something that would fit all of our work. And while the title does fit each of us a little differently, I think that was what we came up with that worked the best for us, for four of us. You know, we could have gotten more vague, you know, but we thought it was strong.
I mean, when we first were putting the proposal together, I actually hadn't been to Iceland yet. And the work I was doing then, I was very interested in other fragile parts of the landscape, estuaries, forest, dry forest fire things. So I was working in color, not this sort of monochromatic palette. And so for me, the trip was a huge pivot with my work, just completely changed what I was doing. But fortunately, it still fit under the umbrella, or the umbrella even better.
And I was doing this biomaterial when we came up with this, and I guess, you know, we were thinking about both the natural forces of nature and then the things that are being forced on nature. So it's kind of the internal dynamics of nature as well as the external ones that are either sometimes man-made and sometimes not, just sometimes the evolution of our planet and life and environment. So I think we were thinking about, and a lot of us were working with natural materials. So the wax is from beeswax, and work on wood panels and so on. And I think it just seemed to be the best fit for us and the things that we care about the most.
What are some of the other titles that you've worked on?
This right away, didn't we?
So long ago.
I think we came up with this
We came up with
first.
this first, and then we looked for other
when you were.
Well, we just finished having a show, the whole group. New England Wax is made up of 32 artists from 6 New England states. And we just had a show in P-Town, which was, I'm sorry, Wellfleet, yeah, right next door, called Transparency. And so people addressed the theme and in different ways. And then some of our other ones, Relationships was at the Southern Vermont Arts Center last summer.
Chroma.
Oh yes, Chroma was another one, which was curated by Marina's husband, who's in the back.
I did not curate.
Oh, you did curate.
I facilitated it, but
Oh,
I
okay. I see.
maybe I had my fingers in it, but
Yeah.
I really didn't. I don't want to claim curate.
So that was Chroma.
Yeah.
And what were some of the other titles? I don't remember.
No.
Katuit.
I don't know.
I don't remember.
Go to the website.
Look it up. But it is an interesting challenge to have a theme that can make a show cohesive enough with our, people's work that is very varied. And I think that's a big challenge.
There you do. Yes.
I'm even before that.
Yeah. Any other questions? No? Yes, go ahead, Angel.
As an artist, I think about the waste I create in my studio. I think about it a lot, and but maybe you were sort of asking about that too, like with the cleanup is always the worst part, and at least with encaustic, which you don't really have to clean up too much, except you've got all the paper towels and the rags, and and I don't know, it's a problem. Definitely is a problem. I mean, I'm sure even with what you're doing here, there's probably some cleanup involved. I mean, although maybe you thought that through too, but I mean, I guess we can just try to be better, and I have just started working in acrylic, and so I have to, I'm
Try the natural earth paints. They're really great.
Okay, I'm gonna get rid of those, but
Yeah, I do have a resource sheet for artists that I haven't written down here, and it's on my website too, on the resource page of companies that are trying to address this issue, either in terms of what happens to what you put in the wastebasket, but also the materials that you use. There are substitutes for matte medium, which also is petroleum derived, and there are other materials that, because even if you collect acrylic paint, for example, and you use a system which Golden Company has put together for collecting it, still goes to the landfill. So it's still that continuing issue. I just find myself being much more concerned with, I reuse any nitrile gloves that I wear when I'm working till they're just falling apart. I don't, I just try to be as careful as I can, but, it is a challenge for artists, I think. It is definitely a challenge.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge for everybody, even not the artists.
Yes,
So
right.
it is really important for us as artists, but if we were doing another job, we would probably be generating almost an equal amount of trash in a given week. And we all need to be more responsible with what we do and what materials we use and how we throw it away. So it's not just artists.
Absolutely.
Well, I just think that I'm just speaking freely, not having thought about it thoroughly, but, there's there's environmental aspects of what we do as artists, but there's also the importance of being able to express oneself and not letting factions of society make us feel guilty about what we're doing. Yeah, I don't know how to say it, but I think it's really important. I mean, yes, I really care about what I use and what I do ultimately. I feel pretty good about what I'm doing, thank God. But it's almost really vital for people to feel that they can express themselves.
Absolutely.
You know, have that opportunity, whether it's with watercolors or, you know, using leftover aluminum foil or any number of ways of creating and not feeling the political pressures to, you know, that would inhibit them and drum their creativity out of them. So that's just crazy.
It's a tricky balance. It really is, and I think just trying to be conscious of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you know, when I was the climate change artist in residence, I did feel like I needed to be really careful because I don't want to make fellow artists defensive. On the other hand, I also think that some of them just aren't aware of some of the other options that might enable them to achieve their artistic goals with maybe different materials, that's all. But it is tricky. Stephanie and I have talked about this quite a lot. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, I just want to say, you know, thank you for submitting the proposal. So for Ava, we have these main galleries, and artists will submit proposals and to show in the main galleries, and sometimes we can get between 70 and 100 artists that apply. So congratulations to her for being one of the few. I think we do 8 exhibitions. So when I say exhibitions, it means like at, you know, there's 7 artists showing, but it's at one exhibition. The way I look at it is one exhibition, but there are 8 in a calendar year. So kudos to you.
Well, and we really want to thank you for all the immense work all along the process to get us to this point.
Yeah.
And, you know, I want to thank us as a team for the work we did together. So, but thank you very much. Thank you to Ava. It's really,